Dialogue 4, International Finance in a Multipolar World. This will see how the rules of international finance can be revisited and existing and new multilateral frameworks strengthened and made more representative. For this dialogue, I request Chair of the session, Professor Bhagwan Chowdhry, Area Leader and Professor of Finance at the Indian School of Business. I also invite Professor Shamika Ravi, Member, Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and Director of Research and Senior Fellow, Governance Studies, Brookings, India. May I also invite Professor Amartya Lahiri, Director, Center for Advanced Financial Research and Learning. Over to you, Bhagwan. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's 4 o'clock. Do you really want to be here? Okay, but some of you are probably sleepy. So this is what we are going to do. This is a good thing. Can you all get up? Stand up. Please stand up. Okay, raise your hands. Like this. Up. Take a long breath. And now this is what I want you to do. Shout as loud as you can. Okay, great. Wonderful.
I didn't realize it was serious.
Okay. This session is about international finance. And I have told my panelists today that यार थोड़ा शांत हो जाइए. I have an attention deficit disorder. So I cannot ask long questions and I cannot listen to long answers. So I'm going to ask them questions, and if they go on and on, I'm going to interrupt them, okay? And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the audience rather quickly, so you get a chance to ask questions as well. And the same rules apply. The question you ask should have this following characteristic. The first statement has to be a question. You understand? It has to end in a question mark. And there should be no second statement. Okay. You can introduce yourself, but make sure it's not your matrimonial ad. And it should certainly not be in your obituary, because we don't really want it to be your obituary, you know? Yeah. So, okay, all right. So we are going to go like this. So, Shamika. Both Shamika and Amartya are colleagues and friends from many, many years. So I know them quite well. And they've had a long history of being an academic and practitioners and both. So Shamika, you went to college in Delhi?
Yes.
Which college?
Lady Shri Ram College.
Lady Shri Ram College. Anybody here from Lady Shri Ram? Not many ladies here? Okay. And Amartya, you also went to Delhi?
Yes, but not to Lady Shri Ram.
Not to Lady Shri Ram. Although you did spend time there from time to time.
On the outside, but yeah, that is true. Not on the inside, but on the outside.
Which college did you go to?
I went to St. Stephen's.
St. Stephen's. And then both of you went to the US to get your PhDs. You went to University of Maryland, Amartya?
Yeah.
And Shamika, you were at NYU. Okay. And I went to University of Chicago. So we all kind of, went to the US. And look, we are all here now in India. Okay? Many, many years later. So I'm going to try and ask a few questions about, okay, so let me say a few more things then. Since your NYU days, of course you were, Shamika, you were a professor at ISB. You taught here for many years. You continue to teach, in fact, at Mohali campus.
Yes.
Okay. And Amartya, you were my colleague at UCLA.
Yeah, many years ago.
Many years ago.
Yeah.
And then you went to UBC. And last 2 years?
I'm still, I'm on leave from UBC, but for the past 2 years, I've been heading up this research institute, which is promoted by the Reserve Bank of India, called CAFRAL. So I was the director. I actually stepped down yesterday.
You stepped down here, which means?
My term finished. My term finished yesterday. So.
And that means you're allowed to say anything you want to. Is that a yes or a no?
Yeah, it's a nervous yes.
It's a nervous yes. Because, I had Viral here a couple of weeks ago. Anybody saw my thing with Viral? Viral Acharya won't say anything that wasn't approved by the governor. I mean, can you believe that? Okay, that's not a restriction on you, is that right?
As of today, no, yeah. As of today, I don't have it.
And even if it were, you think he's going to announce it that...
Okay, so Shamika,
yeah,
the same thing applies to you. Now you are at Brookings Institute.
Yes, I am.
And you do a lot of research.
Yeah.
You do research that actually matters.
I'd like to believe so.
And
Well, let's actually spend 1 second on that. It actually matters because a lot of policy making in India has traditionally been based on either idiosyncrasies, individuals' beliefs. So the more research which is empirically founded and which has immediate impact actually does become impactful over and beyond its academic sort of expectations.
And I've heard that you have the Prime Minister's cell phone number. Is that right or not? What does he call you? Does he call you Samika ji? अब आप ही बताइए क्या करें?
Oh no, no.
Yes or no?
No. आप ही बताइए क्या करें तो बिल्कुल नहीं कहते.
अच्छा, okay. But he does call you Samika ji. Okay, so let's start with international finance. So the world is kind of in a strange situation. After the Second World War, we went to Bretton Woods, where we all said, well, let's peg our exchange rates with each other so that the world has this certainty about what the exchange rates are going to be. And in 1971, President Nixon said the famous 3 words, and we went off the Bretton Woods. We went to flexible exchange rates. And now, we're going even farther. We are saying even the exchange rates, which were somewhat independent, so we said, oh, the central bank should be independent. But now in the US, we are saying, nah, the Trump is saying, no, we can control you a little bit. And something like that is happening here as well. So we're becoming more local. Amartya.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, the world has gone through actually many different forms of exchange rate arrangements, starting with the fixed exchange rate, 30-year period. But there was some sort of consensus, at least in the post-1972-73, post-1974 period, that countries transited into having their own exchange rate policies. So, and that was perfectly okay. Some countries were having fixed exchange rates, others were having flexible ones, some others chose currency boards, all a gamut of arrangements that existed. Now, within all of that, the underlying principle was that if your fundamental policy setup and the fundamentals of your economy are inconsistent with the exchange rate regime that you've chosen, markets will end up punishing you.
Yeah,
and that's how the whole thing used to work. We have now transited into a new normal where we are somehow, thinking that markets are not alert enough or are not going to do the punishment, and so therefore now it's all of a sudden it has become an issue of policy negotiation between the US on the one hand in particular, which is the one which is really pushing this currency manipulator idea on anybody that is running a trade surplus with them. And that is a new normal because in general this is some sort of an idea that prices are sticky for long periods of time, so you can artificially distort your terms of trade for infinitely long periods by choosing to have a currency that is out of alignment with other parameters. That has historically just not been true because there are things that actually do change. So it's a new normal, but it's somewhat of a weird new normal because that's not at least how traditional economics
You
tends to
use
work.
the word weird and normal in the same sentence.
Yeah, I called it new normal because it's like
New weird, new,
post-truth.
okay,
Yeah,
all right.
it's like,
Shamika, what do you think? So you think Maharashtra should have its own exchange rate? And how about Hyderabad?
Well, I'll tell you one common misconception that we see in the public debate when it gets to foreign exchange. We are, of course, in a weird situation, as Amartya mentioned, particularly because now the belief is that, look, China's done it and done it so well and they've gotten away with it. So there is a new legitimacy to these kind of interventions. But what you see in the conversation in the press about how equating, for instance, $100 equals 100 rupee to dollar, that kind of a parity is a show off. It's a show of strength, of the economy, and that's just such a wrong view of economics.
I think, let me say it. I think you're saying journalists don't know anything about exchange rate.
Yes,
True?
actually, I am.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any journalists here? Yeah. You guys don't know anything. Okay. Just admit it. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, so no. Going back to the seriousness of this is, again, the lack of enough research in the public discourse when it gets to economic matters. And that was also a concern that if you were in the earlier panel, you saw that, even foreign policy, international relations, when even in terms of bilateral investment treaties, when they're being written, it's really the economists are not there in a lot of these discussions. So they remain strategic in nature. There's a lot of politics in the conversation, but the details is where I think, at least as far as India is concerned, our capacity is so limited. So it's in commerce, it's in conversations on foreign policy, also the economy as a whole. I think the conversations are very distorted because one, there isn't enough understanding of basic macroeconomics, I think, in amongst people, and I think.
So whose fault is that? I mean, I would say the reason politicians are not talking to the economists is because they say economists always say on one hand and on the other.
Yeah.
They don't have answers.
Yeah. Well, but that is life.
Do we have answers? Okay. Let me ask you a very direct questions to both of you. Did both of you really know 6 months ago that we are going to have 5% growth rate?
6
if you
months
did,
back.
Why didn't you tell us?
Except if we told you, it would probably have happened sooner. So you have to realize that there is, I mean, not that, I don't know about Amartya, I'm definitely not important enough to have big announcement effects. But you have to be careful about your projections. And again, going back to what is the empirical basis for a lot of, a lot of these announcements. But 6 months back, actually, by then the macro indicators had begun to look bad. And so if you actually projected, there was a sense that there is a slowdown coming. Now, of course, the debate is whether it is cyclical or structural in nature. I tend to believe it is long-term structural.
Okay. So I'm going to give Amartya a chance, but I think you said something which kind of, passed it by. You said these things are self-fulfilling. So if we say we are going to grow at 8%, we are more likely to grow at 8%.
No, I don't think it's as
Isn't
simple
that
as
what
that.
You said? You said if you said 5%, it will be 5%. So corollary of that is if we say 8%, we will be at least 7.
Well, then we should be saying 10%.
Okay, all right. Okay.
But no, again, Bhagwan, more seriously, I think economy really has to
I'm
be
being
at the...
totally serious, you know that.
Economy has to be at the heart of our public policy making today.
Okay. So let me give Amartya a chance. CAFRIL was really a research arm of RBI, right? Does it mean did these guys ever listen to you?
Well, I mean,
By the way, he finished his term yesterday. So,
yeah. Okay. To be brutally honest, I think till about 8 months ago, I think we had a place at the table.
you knew.
No, but that when we said stuff, there would be some attention being paid from internally. That's why I thought that was your question. Were people listening inside the RBI, listening to what we were saying?
He's using euphemisms. Okay.
But that has clearly diminished over the past 8-9 months. It's been that space clearly has declined. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's as much focus on research-based assessments that are being put out. Now, the RBI has its own. I can only speak about how much space we were being given. That doesn't mean that the RBI internal research was not being showcased to
Does
as part of
RBI
the
do
policy.
any internal research?
Well, they have a research department. Actually, every
They have a
department has a
research-
research.
that was not my question.
So, yeah, no, they have a lot of researchers. What they do is not what you or I would typically call research, which is somewhat of a different thing. It's not what is good, what's bad, but it's a different definition. It's more like business economists, the way they would approach, which is very valuable, but not necessarily what a central bank does.
Okay.
Since we've, at least I've worked at a central bank, research at central banks, which informs policies of a different type. That is not what is going on at the RBI.
Okay, so let me switch a little bit here, which is the following. These questions about what is the growth rate and what's not are soon going to be moot because we are going to have a lot of data. And we are going to have so much data that in fact we won't need to ask anybody. We look at things like electricity consumption, we look at fuel consumption, we look at city lights, and we'll be able to figure out what's going on in the economy in real time.
Actually,
Right,
just on that,
yes.
let me just add, just picking up where you're leading, and it sort of relates to what Shamika was saying earlier. In terms of why did people not necessarily, just one day before this latest 5% number came out, everybody was saying we expect 5.7%, we expect 5, nobody was saying 5. Even outliers were saying 5.5. So the question is, how can people who make forecasts for a living be so totally off in terms of their public pronouncements? And the problem is, what's been going on is people are not trying to forecast the data. They're trying to forecast what the CSO is going to put out. And those two things are not necessarily the same.
And CSO is?
It's the Central Statistical Organization.
Central Statistical Office,
So,
yeah.
and there's a subtle problem there, because if you're trying to forecast what the first number that the CSO is going to put out, that's a whole different thing from actually forecasting what GDP growth is. For the longest time in markets, if you actually would talk to people in markets, they would say that they would just take whatever number the CSO is putting out and subtract off to 2%. And that's what's been going on in the last 3 years.
The zero error.
Yeah, so there's it's an
Yeah.
intercept term. They would just knock it off. And so, but that's clearly not something that you can go out and make forecasts based on that, because you are judged based on how close you come to what the CSO's growth number
Okay,
is.
so
And
what
there's
I'm
a problem
saying
there.
is-
There's a difference between those two things.
So I'm saying the CSO stuff should become irrelevant.
So what you're saying is exactly that, there can be no further uncertainty about what the true number is. And that's where all this big data that is going to show up is going to somewhat make things a lot
Does that
easier.
sound reasonable to you, that we
Yeah,
are going that way? Shamika?
No, Bhagwan, I don't, electricity usage, night lights data, we actually use all of this. But all of these, at the end of the day, are proxies. They might be highly correlated,
Yeah.
but they are not exactly the value added in the economy.
No, I
So it's an
understand.
accounting exercise that the CSO does, and now the CSO is one arm. It's the government's, but the research institutions.
But Shamika,
we
that's
have-
not true. The CSO is not doing an accounting exercise. It's doing an estimation exercise.
Sure.
It is not an
Yes,
accounting.
yes.
It doesn't add up.
It's
The
an
numbers.
estimation, but can you do that estimation simply based on projections from electricity usage and night lights and all other proxies? I don't think so.
But at least you can figure out the bias.
Well, over time, yes. But the point, Bhagwan, is these are all now empirical exercises. At the end of the day, you need a model, you need to discuss this data, you need to put out these estimates. Frankly, I have seen very few estimates come out from independent institutions which are saying that this is our projection. A lot of it is conjecture. A lot of it is journalistic, and I'm sorry, we can't take that seriously.
Okay,
so it's, again, at the heart of what I'm trying to talk about today is one of the reasons why we keep going round and round on a lot of these things is the research capacity in this country is so limited that we're constantly then pushing back and forth, and therefore the uncertainty.
And why is that?
We have not valued research
have not
traditionally,
valued.
number one. And number two, the economy has gotten more complex.
Okay, by the way, ISB motto is research-based institution. So please, yeah, okay.
No, it's very, very important. The second is the economy has gotten a lot more complex than it was 15, 20 years back. In fact, the definition of a job today is not what it was, let's say, 20 years back. You measured unemployment every 5 years and that was okay. Now it's not okay anymore, which is why the movement towards a PLFS, or the idea should be to move towards real time, the Naukri.coms and etc. of the world. You have exchanges where jobs, vacancies are posted. So over time, we will have to create these alternate models through which you have a real time estimate, or at least a BLS type structure, where quarterly we have a good estimate for some of these macro indicators.
So we will move in that direction.
100%.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about China, which is, for 2 decades we were told that China was growing at 10 or 12%. Were they?
Oh dear. The thing about China, and this is what worries me, because we do compare ourselves with China all the time, but China is just such a different beast altogether. We know about China what China wants us to know about China.
You're not going to answer that question.
No, not easy at all, because I wish there was the kind of scrutiny
but
of Chinese. For instance, they've had a massive banking
crisis.
crisis.
Whether their numbers were biased 2% up or 2% down, with hindsight?
There's actually been quite a good study on this by Chiang Tai-shek. In fact, one of your Chicago, is now no longer in Chicago, I think. But anyway, so what they do is they try to compute the numbers from the aggregate numbers and then build up from the disaggregated thing. And it turns out that there is a bias if you start aggregating from the disaggregated numbers, the provincial numbers, because of precisely the political incentives that are there at the level at which this reporting is happening. And so they have a definite measure for that, which is.
And what did he find?
I think it was about 1.5% or something like that.
So they were overestimating.
They were overestimating.
The official numbers.
But the aggregate numbers were okay. I mean, the ones that were being generated centrally. The problem is every time there were provincial numbers that were getting aggregated, that's where the bias was. You can do the primal and you can do the dual.
Okay. So the conjecture I'm making is that as we get more and more finer data, it will become harder and harder to lie.
I totally agree.
Because the story won't match up.
Yeah.
It's kind of when you're having an affair, you sort of make one thing up, but your credit card shows or something else shows. Not like I have a lot of experience in this, but, right? So that would make it harder for officials.
Absolutely, and that's exactly why when I said markets were, when they were trying to put out assessments to their own clients, that's what they've been doing. So the only people to whom, I mean, what was surprising about the Arvind Subramanian paper actually was, I mean, independent of all the end numbers and so whether you, but the fact that he thought that it should be 2% lower, well, markets had been doing it for like 3 years, using a lot of those same stats that he was using, which are, as Shamika said, these are indicators that correlate, these are like leading indicators, some coincident indicators, but people have been doing it already. So more of those indicators that we get, and you have some sort of a mapping to what the actual number is. And there are going to be errors, of course, and so the more data you get, you sort of put in more variables, you take out more variables. It's going to be though very hard to continue with a number that the CSO is putting out that is very different from what is coming out from all this big data that presumably is going to come up at higher frequency and a much broader set of indicators. So it's going to be a cross-check. On the other hand, it still will never take away the basic problem, which I think Shamika is right on that all forecasts at the end of the day are about trying to match what the official statistical agency is putting out. Now, if the statistical agency may be putting out a number, every forecaster is evaluated by how close they come to that number. So what number they put out officially versus what number they tell their clients to base all investments on may well be two different things. But these forecasts that we see from private forecasters, etc., are all about trying to match the CSO number. That's where the CSO organization has to be, much more professional in the way they're going about things. They have to be much more open in terms of, it shouldn't be clamming down on data saying, I'll release it when I want to, I won't release it, I won't tell you my methods, and just constantly saying we are using the latest methods without, they have to be It has to be a much more transparent process.
You know, Bhagwan, one thing that would perhaps take away the government's woes as far as data credibility is concerned, that every time a new report on statistics comes out, there should be an accompanying methodology document with it. That's it.
There should be
There should be another document with it, which basically says this is the methodology. Because it's not like there is a grand conspiracy.
That's right.
At the end of the day, this entire situation can be explained as just saying these are just, you know, certain empirical exercises done in a manner which then doesn't lend itself to these scrutinies.
In fact, we do that with our research papers. We often ask our graduate students, our PhD students to replicate a study. So we could do that with these numbers as well. As soon as they come out, we can tell our researchers, hey, can you replicate it? And if there's a lot of replication exercises, we'll have a lot of confidence in that.
You know, the PLFS data, that generated a lot of, you know, media speculation, 45-year-old, you know, highest unemployment and so on and so forth. Now, one thing perhaps people don't realize, you know, the PLFS is a completely different way to measure unemployment, number one. We've moved to the computer-assisted, you know, these are not surveys the way the NSS employment, unemployments were done. Now, the minute you move to a CAPI system, for instance, in the US, when that happened, it was treated as a structural break because refusal rate for a CAPI-based investigation rises to close to 80%. The only people who take these are usually people who have at least 45 minutes to an hour or so. So there are many fundamental non-sampling errors. I'm sorry we have gotten into the details of the statistics, but it's very important. But the moot point is, when that happens, when you have a different measure altogether, then we cannot put out a report with 2 lines in the beginning which says, different methodology, therefore please don't compare. And then inside you do exactly that. You compare different years. It's just bad research. I don't know how else to put it.
So transparency both about data and about the methodology.
You know, on this, since this is supposedly a forum on international finance, I'll just try and bring it a little, connect this to international finance. You know, this transparency of data is extremely also important from the perspective of a country that is now thinking about issuing sovereign bonds. So, moment you start thinking of issuing sovereign bonds, these things are not issued in isolation. There are covenants under which these things are issued. If at some point international markets believe that this data, because they are investing based on the data that's being put out. So if this data doesn't line up with, or somebody then comes back and shows more of these Subramaniam kind of papers which are suggesting that things are not quite what the CSO is saying, etc., will lead to a court case. I mean, you know, this it'll be, somebody will file a case, some creditor is going to file a case in New York.
And as long as it comes to the Indian courts, we'll be fine.
No, because these are issued in New York. These covenants are not based on Indian courts. These are issued with whichever, whether you're issuing it in New York or in London, wherever you're issuing these sovereign bonds, these covenants are issued under those local laws. So there will be a troop of people.
So the metrics are going to be metrics
so this
that
is
are
extremely
reliable.
important that we don't horse around with this stuff.
Okay,
I mean,
I'm going to go to the audience, okay, and see if you have questions. So yes, sir.
Rajiv, I would just like to ask you what percentage of the discussion till now relates to the dialogue that we were going to have today.
What do you mean? Can you say that again?
What percentage of the discussion?
This is international finance. What part of you are objecting to?
No, I'm only saying that what percentage of the discussion here relates to this subject which is given behind you?
International finance in a multipolar world? Are we missing something?
Well, we did start with, we did have, I hear the complaint, but we did start with exchange rates, and we have gone to sovereign bonds, and we might get further, you know, as we
mentioned
progress.
China,
It's like, you know, it's like data release.
Are you a journalist by any chance? Okay. Yes, sir.
When we are talking about international finance in a multipolar world, we frequently come across some laws enacted by countries like US called CATSA, which prevent us from remitting money against genuine business transactions. Is this going to be replicated by other countries as well, is my question.
Do you know about this?
No, I don't. So this is U.S. laws which prevent Indians from remitting money from the U.S. to India?
It's like this. CATSA expanded form is countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. Given a case where I had to remit money to Ukraine, where the company in Ukraine is held by a company in Russia, America, which is against Russia right now, prevents me from remitting money through banking channels to Ukraine. That's the issue.
Well, this is an ongoing issue with pretty much, a lot of American transactions where, because the U.S. has used its political interest to arm twist, so it's going on with the sanctions on Iran. So it's, I guess, a risk of doing business with the U.S. I mean, so the question is how much of this is priced in when one is, if of course it becomes endemic, at some point the cost of doing business is going to be so high that people will try and avoid. I guess the Europeans are already thinking about precisely this issue. So I guess once again one has to, markets have a way of trying to push back against rank abuses, but clearly in the interim, the punishment may or may not be as fast. But I don't know if you've.
Yeah.
Actually, that takes us a little bit to this multipolar, the conversation. After the 2008 recession, in the financial crisis that we saw, the general sense was the subprime, the housing. Yeah. At that point, the expectation was that because there was this kind of a financial crisis in the US, you would see flight of capital away from the US markets into perhaps the emerging markets. But there's a very good book by Ishwar Prasad, which basically tells you that despite all the uncertainty in the financial markets in the US, and then subsequently global financial markets, the net dollar flow was into the US economy. So Amartya, it's a relative uncertainty across different countries that affects international capital flow. And Ishwar's point, I think, in his book is basically that it's institutions, that it's the institutions of the US. People feel safe in investing.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't think that's the issue. But the safety is not, a given primer that the U.S. came down, Moses came down with a tablet that thou shalt be safe. The U.S. built up this safety over time, this reputation. The point I was trying to make is that they keep doing this, at some point that reputation will get lost. So nothing is permanent in life. I mean, it might seem like that, that for 40 years that's how it's been. It's a fact of the matter is, if you're looking for a safe asset globally today, you still go to the US. So there's a crisis. In fact, at the end of when the financial crisis hit, where did all the global money end up? Back in the US, looking for safe assets in the US.
How about gold?
How
about gold?
That too, yeah.
That too. There's a little bit of gold, but in terms of financial assets, that's where everybody heads. And, independent of how greatly performing we are and so on and so forth, fact of the matter is emerging market funds and US junk bonds are pretty much very, very correlated. They move, so that's how, you inevitably see, problems anywhere in the US ultimately transmitting itself on emerging markets because funds start flying out from and going into safe US assets. But that is the outcome of 45 years of reputation built. So, but you're also going to lose it for the same reason.
Yeah. This question in the front here.
Hello. My specific question is to Shamika. Myself, Neha Dwivedi. I'm spearheading public policy functions with one of the global innovators based out of India in biologics. So very importantly, you mentioned that economics being at the heart of public policy making. So I would like to understand one or two key lessons in the context of national health schemes like Ayushman Bharat, state schemes like Bhamasha in Rajasthan or Arogyashri in the region. What is that lesson on health financing which we can draw from them, being economics speaking to public policy making? What is that key thing from the global such finances schemes around we can draw from it? Thank you.
Sure. One thing is, it's the financing of healthcare in an economy which is going to determine the long-term sustainability of any of these. So it's the financing instrument of choice. Do you know that the US spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare? And it has very similar health outcomes as Singapore. And guess how much Singapore spends? 4%. 4%.
How much do we spend in India?
We should be spending 2.5 as per the promises of the Prime Minister, so we are closing in. We are a little over 1.6 right now. But the point is, the US and Singapore example is basically telling you that the financing instrument, because US is an insurance-based market, financing model, and Singapore they have a savings base. So basically they have a pot which they create for every citizen, and that pot can be used for healthcare, housing, and a few other things. Which means the basic incentive problems and the adverse selection moral hazard issues that we talk about is not there in that Singapore model. So in insurance, what happens, and any of you who have been to a hospital, if you're insured, then the chances that you will be overdiagnosed, you'll be doing many more tests and diagnostics is very high, because neither the patient nor the doctor has an incentive to reduce usage. So insurance by its very nature leads to cost escalation. Now coming to Ayushman Bharat. Ayushman Bharat, again, I take exception to the media, the way it keeps covering. Ayushman Bharat has two components. Insurance is one part of it. Wellness center, or the creation of these sub-centers which are like well-enhanced primary health centers, are a fundamental second component of that. No one talks about it. And that, I think, in the long term is far more important, because when you have well-structured, well-performing primary health centers, you reduce the overall cost of healthcare in a country because things are caught early on. The lessons learned, particularly the states you're talking about, India, whenever we say Indian economy, I think we have to move beyond national statistics to state statistics now. It's very important we talk about state economies.
And you have done a lot of work, and you find a lot of differences.
Huge differences. So even in terms of Ayushman Bharat, I think the second order problem that we are going to now be grappling with in terms of Ayushman Bharat is that there are parts of the country where government hospitals work very well. Kerala, Tamil Nadu. In fact, Tamil Nadu is the real poster child for health reforms in India, not as much Kerala. You have places like Chhattisgarh, Goa, Uttarakhand, Himachal. In these states, public health care actually works very well. And how do we know this? More than 75% of people in these states go to public hospitals for their care, because it works. Now, if insurance, which is publicly financed, basically funds healthcare which is publicly delivered, then the cost escalations don't happen, because government doctors are not going to make money when they do one extra C-section. But many parts of the country, we fundamentally depend on private healthcare. UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, large states. So when the government hospital doesn't work, nobody goes. So it's not just about rich or poor. The general fallacy we have that public care is for the poor, super specialty tertiary care is for us. No. In fact, in the southern states and Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, etc., where it works, across quintile groups, rich, poor, middle income, everyone is going to public care. Where it does not work, nobody goes, not even the poor. So now you can imagine what will be the cost escalation for Ayushman Bharat in the states which are privately delivered. We will see a massive divergence, and we have to be prepared. Arogyashri has taught us a lot. In terms of in 2007, it's been here in Andhra and Telangana now. That fraud detection, what are the IT systems? So now we have gone to the back of a lot of those early detection, red flags, etc., that you use, new IT methods to catch these things.
So the same kind of big data is going to make insurance products actually more
viable.
Feasible.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the National Health Agency is exactly doing
this. Is this international finance enough for you or no? Okay, just kidding. Not tempting you. Over there. Yes, sir. Yes.
Hello. This question is to the panel. It's about the yesterday's news on the bank mergers. So the question is, Shamika ma'am and the sir to you, is we are still grappling with the it's
NPA
not yet
problem.
Clear. Plus we are seeing the slowdown in the auto sector as well, which is also exposed to a good amount of credit from the Indian banks. Now in this situation, when we are merging the smaller size PSUs, so coming from the standard learnings on merger and acquisition.
I'm looking for a question mark.
Yeah. So how do you think the effectiveness of the merger will be? Because there could be a change of blame from bank to bank. during this situation, right? Who
Okay.
will own the NPAs?
Okay, not quite international, but an important point, which is given the NPA problem, the fact that we are merging some banks, do you think that will adequately address the NPA problem? Do you think it will address at all?
No, I think it's a, short of basically accepting all the NAIC committee recommendations, which had to do with overhauling the management of public sector banks, that's number one, or privatization. I think this is the closest we come to basically reforming it. Now, I'll tell you, we often think privatization might be the solution to the NPA problem of public sector banks in India, and I've actually argued in favor of privatizing some of them. But there are nuances to this. For instance, even Punjab National Bank, which is one of our public sector banks with the highest NPAs, one has to go back, it's not all just poor management, as we like to believe. In fact, a lot of it, Bhagwan, has to do with the earlier point which you jokingly made, but which is so fundamental, is that Supreme Court of India, in fact, a lot of the NPA happened, or the books of Punjab National Bank overnight started to look back when all the coal blocks were basically, the Supreme Court said these are all illegal. And overnight, a sector which was profitable and which a lot of our public sector banks had exposure to are now, not feasible at all. So it's not as simple as saying, management. And all said and done today, we are also looking at, Yes Bank is looking fragile. I mean, so privatization in India is not always the easy solution or the policy response to a badly performing public sector bank.
But at least it's the right direction. By
Consolidation,
taking
you
2
mean?
or 3 public sector banks and merging them and saying, oh, now they are 60,000 crores, and the good thing and the bad things are going to cancel out, that doesn't seem like an answer either.
So I think you're really trying to isolate the management problems. In terms of not having to deal with 12 badly run banks, you will now have to deal with 4 of them.
In terms of regulation?
And number one. Number two, I really hope now, and I'm not privy to the conversations happening behind, but I would hope that, when the public sector banks were created in the 70s, 80s, and of course, barring nationalization and the disaster of it, initially a lot of them were formed for very different roles. Some were meant to be agriculture finance, some were meant to be long-term infrastructure finance, and over time, because of the way they have been run, they're all now clones of each other. And therefore, they're highly correlated in the bad performance. So I think that's what I mean now. Perhaps this is a time to specialize, and make the books look better.
Amartya, what were you guys thinking about? This must be something very close to what RBI is.
So I don't know what the RBI is thinking. I can just tell you what I think.
Caffrey, okay.
Yeah. So we have this obsession in India that somehow the government will solve our problems. The government is the problem. If you think about what's been going on for the last 60 years.
The vice president this morning and Ronald Reagan, 1981.
Well, I didn't hear what the vice president said, but yeah, Ronald Reagan for sure. The issue is whichever part of the government that we focus on a lot, the key delivery issues of public services, education, health, infrastructure, finance, which the government has taken over due to having absorbed them. That's where basically our ability to deliver public services, the government has revealed itself to be incapable of doing it. Maybe because of the scale of the problem, maybe because of governance issues, whatever it is. Our problem is the government cannot deliver these services that it has appropriated the rights to. In this world, while there are all sorts of issues with privatization that one can point out in developed countries, and now we are talking about a whole different ballgame about what those guys can deliver in public services versus what we can deliver, which is zilch. We cannot deliver anything. And so consequently, the second best approach here is, it's no surprise that, you talked about the NPA problem. I've actually written a paper on this. So you start examining this NPA problem, what are you going to see? If you break it down, 45% of all Indian NPAs are concentrated in 3 sectors: mines, metals and machinery, and construction. That's it, 3 sectors. And now you ask, standard banking would say that productivity or profits and lending growth should be positively correlated. It is. At the two-digit industry level, you look across, it is positively correlated, except for 3 sectors: mines, metals, machinery, construction. You should expect that a sensible banker who's looking at the bottom line for his shareholders would be allocating credit such that if you find that NPAs are high, NPAs and productivity should be negatively correlated. Right? If a highly productive sector should have on average low. It is true, Indian banks on average across sectors, all of them have that except for 3 sectors: mines, metals and machinery, construction. What are these sectors? It is precisely where the government is involved in delivering infrastructure. Now, whichever way you're doing it, I don't know, there are lots of bright people who are telling them what to do and how to come up with the stuff, but why are these things just negatively correlated? The private banks also have some exposure to these guys. You don't see the NPAs going this crazy. The reason, of course, is precisely what you were suggesting earlier, indirectly, because, and I think you should suggest it much more openly, that the problem is that these bank managers in these big sectors are not making loans based on profitability considerations. They're making loans based on phone calls. They're saying, you have to lend to this guy, you have to lend to this sector because this is our priority sector. Just imagine the situation of the banking sector right now. The banking sector today in India, it's remarkable that it can even breathe. You know, you have 19.5...
It's not the priority of the country, it's the priority of the person making the phone call.
Yeah, it's the priority of the person making the phone call. You know, 19.5% of deposits are already earmarked as SLR. That's gone. Then you've got 40%, which is, you know, of assets have to be in priority sector lending. Who made that up? A bunch of guys sitting around the table. It's like the Radcliffe line. The Radcliffe line was drawn in a similar way. We joke about it to this day, but that's exactly how a lot of these decisions are being made at the level of the government. Some guys are sitting around a table making up decisions, and they're coming up with these numbers.
Coming back to Shamika's thing about there isn't a structure. She said we need to have more economists, but there isn't a research-based policy making that should be looking at these issues in a more systematic way. Let me see if there were any people I missed.
Bhagwan, just one small pointer on, I want to emphasize, Amartya's made this impassioned sort of point, and let me just give you one statistics. You know, the domestic credit that goes to the private sector in China is 140% of its GDP. You know what that number is in India? It's 40%. So now you have to seriously wonder which is the more socialist of the two countries. Meaning, we just have to put faith back into what the PM calls wealth generators. Because your jobs are going to come from there. You just, you know, that unleashing, and I think we do not have, and of course this is home, these are all, you know, this is Indian School of Business. We are talking to the converts, but the point is we don't have enough champions in Delhi. We need to make this plea all the time, make a case for how the growth of the last 30 years, what it has done to this country in terms of poverty eradication, and why private enterprise is such a powerful concept, and we need to support it in all forms.
ISB Delhi. Okay.
ISB.
Yes.
Hello. Hi, this is Aparna. I'm from Economic Development Board, Government of Andhra Pradesh. This question is to Shamika. You did mention about Naukri.com, right? The data on jobs is not at all, I mean, something that we can't dig about at state level or at national level. How keen is the government looking at the aspect of functional labor market information system, LMIS? It is a very critical concept. We have AI and IoT integration.
That was
my
question
ends
right?
there. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to have more data about labor market, employment and unemployment, and different types of employment. Where is that data going to come from?
Well, one is the data architecture in this country is very old, right? And part of that effort over the last 5-6 years has been to overhaul, right? The whole idea of doing a PLFS, the periodic labor force survey, is exactly because you can't wait 5 years for the NSSO. So the effort is there to improve the architecture. All of that still is happening at the center level. We ideally need a MOSPI, Ministry of Statistics Planning, at the state level. Because, I mean, I cannot emphasize this enough. India is 28 state economies. They all have very different
and couple of
pathways.
Union territories. Yeah.
And growing, yeah. And growing, the union territories.
And growing, okay. I see one more question in the middle there with the person with the brown shirt. Yes, young man.
So, I am Jitendra, a student of development studies. My question is for economic policies and economists. Are they really worried about the public health? Because every time a public health crisis happens, nobody talks about the economics of it. Always the socialists and the political scientists take away with whichever incident happened. Take that lychee incident in Bihar. There was no economics, like nobody talks about the economics behind it.
I think
and like
agree with you, Shamika, that we don't have enough economists looking at these are big problems, because these are all problems of resources, and resources is basically what economists talk about, the incentives and allocation. I do want to tell you guys that the chief economic advisor just walked in, and are we going to grow at 8%? Sorry, can you say it again? Please give a mic.
But Bhagwan, he's still trying to finish that.
Yeah, another part of my question, when coming to public health, the public health sector accounts for only 18% of doctors. So 75% people going to 18% doctors and 25% people going to 81% of doctors. How fair it is?
So I'll tell you, we have, there are a series of papers, for instance, if you're interested. It's all open source. You'll have access to it. It's true that 75% of health infrastructure in the country is in the urban areas. So that itself tells you about the skewness in the load of availability. Then in terms of out of pocket, how much money is spent by individual, what is that burden? It is very high for India, right? We have improved it marginally from 67 to 63% now, but China is 36%, Thailand is 11%. So out of every rupee that you're spending on healthcare, only 11 paisa comes from an individual's pocket. The rest is borne by the state, right? In India, that private burden is very high. In fact, that is the reason why there is this renewed effort for Ayushman Bharat. That's number one. But 75% of all IPD, meaning inpatient hospitalization, is private. So we basically fundamentally depend on private hospitals across the country. But in OPD, it's about 55%. So it's still, private sector is a very large part of India's healthcare, and medical tourism is one of our fastest growing sectors. But that coexists, just like India exists in different centuries at the same time. You have one of your fastest growing tertiary care hospital attracting patients from across the Indian Ocean neighborhood. You also have a primary care sector which is dilapidated, and particularly in the big states. So in fact, Ayushman Bharat, I would say, is the first time health has become a political subject, and I'm personally very happy about it, because it's good for citizens to demand it. It just cannot be left for the government. But the way policymakers, nobody wants to be in the health ministry, let's be honest. Everybody wants to be, in finance, or everyone wants to be, part of, right? And what that means, and I make it a point to say this, that social sector is such a lazy way of putting all this important human capital, right? Health, education, gender. social sector. No, it's about time you actually start talking health, education, because each of them have very long-term
Okay,
implications.
Sandeep just came up and he gave me the latest forecast, okay? Which is there was 5 minutes. I thought you were saying 5%. Sorry. Okay. Okay, we are out of time. I am going to give each of my panelists a chance to say in 30 seconds so that that gentleman doesn't beat me up. International finance in a multipolar world. What are those poles? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I don't know.
Shamika?
How can I possibly beat that? No, I'll just go with that.
Okay, I'll say the world is going to become unipolar, and the pole is going to be in this part of the world. With 1 billion people in India and 1 billion people in China, with rising incomes, 8% growth, the whole economic center of gravity is going to shift to this part of the world, and we have to do the work, we have to do the research, and we have to do the dialogue. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening.
Thank you all. Requesting Dr. Vishnuvardhan Reddy, Head of MEA Branch Secretariat, Hyderabad, and Regional Passport Officer, Telangana, to come onto the stage and present the mementos as a token of our gratitude to the speakers. To Professor Bhagwan Chowdhry. Professor Shamika Ravi, Professor Amartya Lahiri, requesting all the speakers for a group photograph.